They abandoned me for my body, she said. But Lone Rancher took her in. Sarah had always believed that one day her family would be the ones to see her for who she truly was.
She dreamed of a time when they would stop judging her for how she looked and start appreciating her for her heart, her kindness, and her strength. But that day never came. Growing up, Sarah never felt truly loved. She was often told she was too much, too loud, too bold, too outspoken. And yet, in the eyes of her family, she was never enough. Her appearance seemed to matter more than anything else. As a young girl, Sarah was constantly aware of the glances from her relatives, the whispers when she wasn't around, and the comments about her body that made her feel more like an object than a person. Her father would often make comments about her weight, even though she wasn't overweight, and her mother would try to hide her body with layers of clothing, as if her figure was something to be ashamed of. It was a constant struggle for Sarah to fit into the mold her family wanted her to be in. She learned early on that her worth in their eyes was based solely on her appearance, and the idea of being accepted for anything deeper felt impossible. As Sarah grew older, she became more aware of how people treated her. Boys at school would ask her out, but their intentions were never pure. They were more interested in showing her off to their friends than in getting to know her. The relationship always seemed to end the same way. Once the thrill of the chase was over, she was discarded. She wasn't seen for the person she was inside, just the body she had. She started to believe that maybe that's all she was good for. Maybe her value was only in how others saw her, and that was all she could ever be. When Sarah entered adulthood, she moved out of her family home, hoping to find a place where she could be accepted for who she was on the inside. She found a small apartment in the city and started a new life, thinking that this time things would be different. She was wrong. The city, with its fast pace and constant pressure to look perfect, only made her feel more lost. Every day she saw people with flawless skin and slender figures, and it felt like she could never measure up. No matter how much she tried to hide her body or change the way she looked, she felt like she was always under scrutiny. It was exhausting. At her job in a small cafe, Sarah felt invisible. Her coworkers would compliment her on how she looked, but those compliments always seemed empty, as if they were just going through the motions. Her boss was more interested in how well she dressed than how well she did her job, and she couldn't help but feel like she was being used. The attention she received felt like a heavy burden. She longed for something more, but she didn't know where to find it. The turning point came one evening when Sarah was invited to a family gathering. Her parents had called her, asking her to come home for a celebration. She reluctantly agreed, hoping that this time things would be different. Maybe they would finally accept her for who she was, not just for how she looked. But when she arrived, she was met with the same old behavior. Her mother, as always, commented on how she should wear more makeup and dress in a more flattering way. Her father barely looked up from his plate when she walked in, made a joke about how she hadn't lost the weight he'd hoped she would. Those words hit Sarah harder than they ever had before. Perhaps she suddenly realized that no matter how much she changed or how hard she tried, her family would never see her as more than her body. They would never accept her for who she truly was. She left the gathering early, feeling defeated and broken. She had hoped for something different, but it seemed that hope was always in vain. As she sat alone in her car, the tears started to fall. She wondered if she would ever be seen for who she truly was. She didn't know how much longer she could keep living in a world where her worth was based solely on how she looked. She had tried to live up to everyone else's expectations, but it felt like it would never be enough. Sarah spent the next few days in a haze, unsure of what to do or where to go. Her thoughts spiraled. She felt trapped in a life where no one seemed to care about her for anything other than her appearance. It was like she was stuck in a cycle of rejection and self-doubt that she couldn't escape from. Brit. She had been abandoned by her family, her friends, and even herself. The world seemed too harsh, too judgmental, and she wondered if she would ever find a place where she belonged. She knew she needed a change, but she didn't know where to start. She had heard of people moving to quieter, more peaceful places to escape the pressures of city life, but it always seemed like something out of reach. Yet, in that moment, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't keep living this way, constantly battling against the world's expectations of her. She needed to leave. She needed to find somewhere she could be herself, without the constant judgment and hurt. And so she packed her things and left the city. Sarah didn't have a clear plan or destination in mind. She just needed to get away. She didn't know where she was headed, but she knew that staying in the place where she had always felt so small wasn't an option anymore. Sarah drove for hours, not really thinking about where she was going. The open road seemed to offer her the freedom she had been longing for. It was a quiet, peaceful feeling, one that she hadn't experienced in a long time. She drove past fields, forests, and small towns, but there was something about the open spaces that made her feel like she could breathe again. Eventually, she found herself in a small, rural area on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, just a collection of houses, a few farms, and endless stretches of land. But it felt like the escape she needed, says. She rented a small cottage far enough from the hustle of the world, and for the first time in a long time Sarah felt a small sense of peace. She didn't have to worry about how she looked or what others thought, but for the first time in years, she could just be.
But as she sat in her cottage, looking out at the wide open landscape, she couldn't shake the feeling of loneliness.
The quietness was soothing, but it also reminded her of how isolated she had always felt. She had escaped the city, but she hadn't escaped the feeling of abandonment. The loneliness still lingered. It was then that she began to wonder if she would ever find the one thing she had been searching for her whole life, a place where she could truly belong. Breath. She thought about her family, her past, and the hurt she had endured. But in that moment she realized that no one else could define her worth. It wasn't about her appearance or her past mistakes. It was about who she was, deep inside. She knew that she had to start over, to rebuild herself from the ground up, but she couldn't do it alone. She didn't know how yet, but she had to find someone who would see her for who she truly was, not for her body, not for her past, but for her heart. And so, as Sarah sat by the window, staring out at the quiet countryside, she began to take the first steps toward healing. It was a journey she didn't fully understand yet, but she knew it was the right one. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could find a place where she was finally accepted, where she was seen for the person she truly was. Great. Tucked away from the city's chaos, were quiet, peaceful, but lonely. She had left behind a life that had made her feel small and invisible, yet she couldn't escape the feeling that she was still haunted by the ghosts of her past. Despite the beauty of her new surroundings, the silence in the cottage was overwhelming at times. She missed the noise of the city, the constant bustle of life, but most of all, she missed the feeling of being seen. Not for her appearance, but for who she truly was. Each day, Sarah tried to adjust to this new life. She spent her mornings tending to the small garden behind the cottage, planting vegetables and flowers, and learning to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. There was something soothing about working the land, something grounding about planting seeds and watching them grow. For a moment, it felt like she could put the pieces of her life back together, one small step at a time. But as the day faded into night, the loneliness would set in. It wasn't the kind of loneliness that made her feel sad, but the kind that made her question whether she had made the right decision. Had she truly escaped, or had she simply isolated herself further from the world, from the chance to connect with others? She wondered if she would always be this way, caught between the world she had left behind and the new life she was trying to build. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as Sarah sat on the front porch watching the sun dip behind the horizon, that she saw him. Caleb.
At first she thought it was just another person passing by, someone from one of the nearby farms.
But as he came closer, she realized he was walking towards her cottage. His presence was steady and calm, like the land itself. He was a man of few words, someone who didn't speak much but whose silence seemed to speak volumes. His eyes were kind, but there was something more to him, something that made Sarah feel like he had a story to tell, just like she did. Caleb was the lone rancher who lived on a farm several miles down the road. She had seen him from time to time while walking into town, but they had never spoken. In fact, she rarely saw anyone, as her cottage was secluded, a quiet escape from the rest of the world.
Here he was, standing in front of her cottage, looking at her with a calm, almost knowing expression. "Evening," he said, his voice low and gravelly, as if he hadn't spoken much that day.
Sarah was taken aback. She hadn't expected anyone to visit her, especially not someone she didn't know. She had grown used to being alone, to managing her life without the need for outside help. But there was something about Caleb's presence that made her feel at ease, like he was someone she could trust. "Evening," she replied softly, unsure of what to say next. There was a long pause between them, and for a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only noise that filled the space between them. Finally, Caleb broke the silence.
"I've seen you around here a few times. I thought I'd stop by and see if you needed anything."
"You're a bit far out from town, and I figured you might be needing some help." Sarah was surprised by his offer. Breaking. She had always prided herself on being independent, on not needing anyone else to get by. She had come here to escape, to find solitude. But Caleb's offer was different. It wasn't about pity or charity. It was just an offer of help, a simple gesture from one person to another. "I'm doing all right," she said, smiling slightly. "But thank you. I appreciate the offer." Caleb nodded, but didn't leave. Brace. Instead, he stayed there for a moment, looking at her garden and the cottage. It was clear that he was taking it all in, studying the life she had begun to build for herself.
"You've got a nice place here,"
he said after a pause.
"I hope it's working out for you." Sarah nodded again, feeling the weight of his words. She didn't know why she had come here, why she had sought out this life, but there was something in Caleb's voice that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she had made the right decision.
He wasn't judging her. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just offering his presence, his quiet companionship. And in that moment, it was exactly what she needed. "Thank you," Sarah said. "It's peaceful, I'll give you that. But sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice, you know?"
"It's easy to be alone, but it's harder to feel like you belong anywhere." Caleb didn't immediately respond.
Instead, he looked off into the distance, as if searching for the right words. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more thoughtful.
I get it. Life can be a lot to carry on your own.
But sometimes the right place finds you, even if you don't know it at first. Maybe this place is where you're meant to be. Maybe it's not about belonging to a place or a group. It's about finding peace with yourself.
His words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like someone truly understood her.
It wasn't about fixing everything or offering solutions. It was about acknowledging the struggle and letting her know that she wasn't alone in it. Caleb's simple words offered her a quiet comfort, and for the first time since arriving at the cottage, she didn't feel so lost. They sat together on the porch for a while longer, neither of them saying much, but the silence between them felt different this time. It wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was just two people sharing the same space, both trying to find their way in the world. And in that moment, Sarah realized that maybe she didn't need to find the answers all at once. Maybe it was okay to take things one step at a time, to let life unfold as it would. As the evening grew darker, Caleb stood up to leave. Well, I should be getting back, but if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. Sarah watched him walk away, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known before. It wasn't because Caleb had given her any grand advice or solved her problems. It was because for the first time someone had offered her help without asking for anything in return. He hadn't tried to fix her or make her feel better. He had simply acknowledged her, seen her for who she was, and let her know that she wasn't as alone as she thought. As Caleb disappeared into the night, Sarah felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Maybe, just maybe, she had found the first piece of what she was looking for. The road ahead was still uncertain, but with each passing day she was learning to accept that uncertainty, to embrace the quiet moments and to allow herself to be seen. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The days seemed to stretch out, and Sarah felt herself settling into a routine. Once filled with the hustle and chaos of the city, was now a quiet rhythm of work, nature, and self-reflection. Each morning she woke with the sun, the light filtering through the trees, and the birds singing their songs. She would get up, make a simple breakfast, and head outside to tend to the small garden she had started. The garden had become a symbol of her new life, a place where she could plant seeds, watch them grow, and nurture something with her own hands. At first it felt like a small escape, a way to distract herself from the pain of her past. But over time, Sarah found that the act of caring for the garden brought her a sense of peace she hadn't expected. There was something calming about being surrounded by plants, watching them bloom and thrive. She had never thought of herself as someone who was good with plants, but now, as she carefully watered and pruned the flowers and vegetables, she felt a sense of accomplishment. She was creating life, and that gave her a feeling of purpose she had missed for so long. As the days passed, Sarah also began to spend more time with Caleb. He wasn't around every day, but whenever he came by, it felt like a quiet, comforting presence in her life. Caleb was different from the people she had known before. He didn't judge her for her past or her choices. He simply treated her with respect, and that was something she had never experienced in her relationships before. But he didn't talk much, but when he did, his words seemed to carry weight. It was as if he had learned the value of silence, something Sarah was beginning to understand herself. One afternoon, Caleb arrived at her cottage with a small bundle of firewood in his arms. Sarah was working in the garden, bending over to pull out weeds that had begun to take over. She didn't hear him approach, but when she stood up straight, she saw him standing there, offering her a smile.
"You need more wood for the fire?" he asked, his voice as steady as always.
Thanks,
Sarah replied, taking the firewood from him.
I do.
I keep the fire going most nights. It's nice to have something warm when the evenings get cold. Caleb nodded, his eyes scanning the garden for a moment before meeting hers again. It's looking good. You've been busy out here. Sarah smiled, proud of what she had managed to accomplish.
Yeah, it's coming along.
It feels good to work with my hands, to see something grow. Caleb looked at her thoughtfully, as if contemplating her words. Life's like that sometimes.
You work at it, bit by bit, and before you know it, you've built something.
His words resonated with Sarah more than she expected. They weren't just about gardening or hard work.
They felt like a reflection of her life. She had spent so many years trying to make herself fit into a mold, trying to meet expectations that had never been her own. But now she was slowly rebuilding herself piece by piece, and it felt like something that had always been inside her was finally starting to bloom. As Caleb placed the firewood next to the door, Sarah invited him to stay for a cup of coffee. She wasn't sure why, but there was something about the quiet companionship they shared that made her feel comfortable. Maybe it was the way he never pushed her to talk, never asked about her past. He simply let her be herself. And that was a rare gift in a world where everyone seemed to have an opinion about who you were supposed to be. The two of them sat at the small wooden table inside Sarah's cottage, sipping their coffee in silence. Caleb's presence was calming, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. It wasn't uncomfortable like she had often felt in the past when she was alone. Instead, it was a peaceful kind of quiet, where both of them could simply exist in the same space without needing to explain themselves.
"You know," Caleb said after a while, breaking the silence, "it's good to see you out here, Sarah. I know you've been through a lot, but there's something about you that seems different now."
Like you're starting to find your place. Sarah's heart fluttered at his words, but she didn't know how to respond. Breath.
She wasn't used to hearing such things. She had spent so much time feeling invisible, feeling like no one truly saw her.
But Caleb's words, though simple, felt like a recognition. It was as if he could see the woman she was becoming, even before she fully understood it herself.
I don't know if I've fully found my place yet, she admitted softly, but I think I'm getting closer.
It's just, I don't know. It feels like there's so much more to discover, so much more to understand about myself. Breath. Caleb looked at her for a moment, as though considering her words. Life's a journey, Sarah. Sometimes you find your way when you least expect it, but it starts with being honest with yourself. And that's what you've been doing here, haven't you?
His words hit her like a wave.
Being honest with herself. That was something Sarah had never truly done before. She had always tried to please others, to meet their expectations. But here, in this quiet corner of the world, she had started to confront her own truths bare. She was learning to accept herself, flaws and all, and for the first time in her life she wasn't seeking validation from anyone else.
I guess you're right,
she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've spent so much time trying to be who everyone else wanted me to be. But now I'm starting to feel like I can just be me. Caleb smiled, his eyes softening. That's all anyone can ever be. And it's enough. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. They weren't just words of comfort, they were words that felt true, words that gave her the strength to believe in herself. Maybe she didn't have everything figured out. Maybe she wasn't the person she had hoped to be just yet. But she was on her way, and that was enough. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself looking forward to Caleb's visits. Breath. Sometimes he would bring firewood or offer to help with the garden. Other times they would simply sit in silence, enjoying each other's company. Breath. She didn't know what it was about him, his quiet presence, his steady demeanor, but she felt a sense of peace whenever he was around. It wasn't about romantic feelings, not yet anyways. It was just about finding someone who didn't judge her, someone who accepted her for who she was. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Caleb stood up to leave. Sarah had grown used to the moments when he would leave, but tonight there was something different. As he turned to walk out the door, he paused and looked back at her.
"You're doing good, Sarah," he said.
"Keep at it." She smiled softly, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, Caleb. I appreciate everything.
More than you know. And with that, he walked out of the door, leaving Sarah alone in the quiet warmth of her cottage.
She stood there for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to find her place in the world. Maybe she had been looking for it in all the wrong places, but now she was starting to build something that was truly hers. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she was learning to trust herself, to trust that she had the strength to keep going. And with each passing day, Sarah felt more and more like the person she had always wanted to be, someone who was worthy of love, acceptance, and peace. The days continued to pass, each one blending into the next. Sarah had gotten used to her new life, though the peace she had sought was sometimes fragile. The quiet moments in her cottage were comforting, but they could also feel isolating at times. Still, Sarah learned to embrace the solitude, finding comfort in the small routines she had developed.
Every morning she would wake up early and head outside to see how her garden had grown overnight.
It wasn't just the plants that had been flourishing, but something inside of Sarah as well. She had found a sense of purpose in the garden, something to care for and nurture, something that was solely hers. It was a small, simple thing, but it had become an important part of her healing process. It was a daily reminder that growth wasn't always fast, but it was constant.
As the days grew warmer, Sarah began to feel more connected to the land around her.
She spent her afternoons walking through the fields, letting the breeze wash over her, and just letting her thoughts wander. The weight of her past was still there, lingering in the back of her mind. But she no longer allowed it to define her. Breath. She had learned to let go of the judgment that had once shaped her, slowly letting go of the need for validation. But there was still one thing that Sarah couldn't shake: the loneliness. While the quiet of the countryside had its charms, there were moments when she longed for deeper human connection. She had gotten used to the solitude, but it didn't mean she didn't miss companionship. She missed the kind of conversations where people didn't judge, where they could just talk about life, about dreams, about the things that mattered most. It was during one of these moments of longing that Caleb came into her life again. He had stopped by once or twice over the past few weeks, helping her with small tasks or simply sitting together in the peaceful quiet of the evening. But one day he came by with a proposal that would change things in ways Sarah hadn't expected.
"I've been thinking," Caleb began, his voice steady as usual. "I've got some extra work to do around the farm, and I could use a hand. You've been doing a lot here, and I thought you might like to get out of the cottage for a bit. There's no pressure, of course, but I could use some help, and I think it might do you good."
"Baba," Sarah looked up from the garden, wiping the sweat from her brow. The idea of working alongside someone again felt both comforting and unfamiliar.
She had been on her own for so long, but Caleb's offer felt different. It wasn't about charity or pity.
It was simply an invitation, an opportunity to be part of something again.
"I don't know much about farm work," Sarah said, half joking, but her voice carried a hint of uncertainty. "Are you sure you want someone like me helping you?" Caleb smiled, his eyes softening. "You don't need to know everything. We can take it slow."
"I've seen how hard you work here. I'm sure you'll catch on quick." His words were simple, but they struck a chord within Sarah. She realized that she had been avoiding doing anything outside her comfort zone for too long. It was easy to stay in the safety of the cottage, tending to her garden and avoiding anything that might challenge her. But she also realized that this invitation was an opportunity to grow in ways she hadn't yet allowed herself to. The next morning, Sarah set out to Caleb's farm, her heart filled with a mix of anticipation and nerves. She didn't know what to expect or how she would manage the work, but there was a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in a long time. As she walked down the dirt road toward the farm, she couldn't help but feel a little lighter. It wasn't just the physical journey to Caleb's farm. It was the metaphorical one she was taking in her own life. For the first time, she was stepping outside the boundaries she had set for herself. When she arrived, Caleb was already outside, tending to the horses. He looked up and gave her a welcoming smile as she approached.
"Glad you made it," he said, wiping his hands on his pants.
"I've got a few things to do today. Some cleaning and maintenance, but I'll show you what needs to be done. You just take it one step at a time, Brass." Sarah nodded, grateful for his calm, steady presence. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but his quiet confidence made her feel like she could do anything. He wasn't rushing her, wasn't pressuring her to be anything more than what she was in that moment. And that made all the difference. Over the next few hours, Caleb showed Sarah the ropes, how to care for the animals, how to repair the fences, and how to manage the different tasks that came with maintaining a working farm. At first, Sarah was unsure of herself. The work was physically demanding, and she had never done anything like it before. But Caleb was patient, offering simple explanations and showing her how to do things step by step. As they worked side by side, Sarah found herself becoming more engaged in the tasks at hand. It wasn't just about the work itself. It was about the connection. She had spent so long in isolation that she had forgotten what it was like to work with someone else, to share in a task and to feel like a part of something bigger than herself. There was a sense of camaraderie in the way Caleb taught her, and Sarah found herself enjoying the process. By the time the sun began to set, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Her muscles ached from the physical labor, but it was a good kind of ache, the kind that came from doing something meaningful, from learning and growing. As she stood next to Caleb, watching the last rays of sunlight dip below the horizon, she realized how much she had missed the feeling of working together with someone else. Caleb turned to her, wiping his brow as he smiled.
"You did good today, Sarah. You've got the hang of it faster than I thought."
Sarah grinned, feeling a flush of pride. "Thanks. It was a lot harder than I thought it would be, but I kind of enjoyed it."
"You're a quick learner," Caleb said with a grin. "I knew you would be." For a moment, they stood in silence, watching the sun set over the fields.
The quiet that had once felt so heavy now felt like a companion. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the shared space, the mutual understanding between them. Sarah realized that she had begun to feel like she belonged, not just in the land, but in her own skin. As Caleb turned to head back to the house, Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had been so focused on the need to escape, to find peace, that she had forgotten the importance of connection. But now, standing there on the farm, with the stars beginning to twinkle above them, she knew that this was where she was meant to be, not just with Caleb, but with herself.
"I'll see you tomorrow?" Caleb asked, glancing back over his shoulder.
"Yeah," Sarah replied, smiling. "I'll be here." And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt the promise of tomorrow. It wasn't about escaping her past or running from her fears. It was about building something new, something meaningful. And she was ready to do it, one day at a time. The days continued to flow by, each one carrying Sarah deeper into the life she had started to build. The farm had become her second home, a place where she felt useful, valued, and most importantly, at peace. Breaths. She had worked hard to put the pieces of her life back together, and now, as she spent more time with Caleb and the farm, she was finally starting to feel like she belonged. Caleb was always there when she needed him, offering guidance, helping with tasks, or simply sitting with her in the evenings. There were no grand gestures or deep conversations. It was the quiet companionship that spoke volumes. Sarah had learned that sometimes the most important connections weren't built on words, but on the shared moments in between them. Bait. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah found herself growing more comfortable with the work. She learned the rhythms of the farm, the way the seasons dictated what needed to be done, the timing of planting and harvesting, and the care required for each animal. But it wasn't just the tasks that had changed her. It was the way she saw herself now, broken by her past. But now she saw herself differently. Each task she completed, whether it was tending to the animals or fixing a fence, reminded her of her own strength. She wasn't the person she had been when she first arrived at the cottage. She wasn't the person the world had tried to make her into. She was someone new, a woman who had learned to take pride in her work, in her choices, and in her own worth. One afternoon, Sarah found herself standing in the middle of the farm, looking around at all she had helped to build. The garden was flourishing, the animals were healthy, and the land seemed to stretch endlessly before her. It felt like a dream, but it was real. She had made this place her own, and in doing so, she had made peace with her past. But there was still one thing that Sarah hadn't fully faced. Her feelings for Caleb had grown over time. He had become more than just a companion. He had become someone she trusted, someone who had shown her a kindness she had never known before. And while she wasn't sure if those feelings were mutual, she couldn't ignore them anymore. They were there, simmering just beneath the surface, and she knew she had to address them before they consumed her.
Caleb had always been a man of few words.
Breaths. He didn't show his emotions openly, and that made it difficult for Sarah to know where she stood with him.
She didn't want to complicate things.
She didn't want to risk the calm, easy friendship they had built, but at the same time she couldn't help but wonder if he felt the same way. One evening, as the sun set over the farm, Caleb invited Sarah to join him on the porch. It had become a tradition of sorts. They would sit there at the end of the day, watching the sky change colors and listening to the quiet sounds of the farm. It was always a peaceful time, a time to reflect on the day's work and to just be.
"Got a minute?"
Caleb asked, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. Sarah looked up from her book, startled but pleased. Of course. What's up? Caleb gave her a small smile, his eyes thoughtful.
"Just wanted to talk. It's been a while since we've had a proper conversation." Sarah set her book down and walked over to the porch, sitting next to him.
The air was cool, the scent of fresh earth and hay drifting on the breeze. Caleb looked out at the land for a moment before turning his attention to her.
"I've been thinking about you," he said, his voice steady. "About how far you've come."
You've built something here, Sarah, and I admire that.
"I've watched you grow, and it's been something special to see."
Sarah's heart skipped a beat at his words. She wasn't sure what to say, so she simply smiled, her cheeks warming. "Thank you. It hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it."
Caleb nodded, looking at her closely. "You've changed."
And not just in the way you work, but in the way you carry yourself. You're not the same woman who first walked through that door. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. She didn't know how to explain it, but he was right. She wasn't the same. She had finally started to believe in herself, to trust that she was worthy of something more. She had come here hoping to escape her past, but what she had found was so much more than that. She had found herself.
"I've had a lot of time to think, too," Caleb continued, "about what we've built here."
Brave house. About what we've both been through. Sarah looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Caleb hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I don't know how to say this, but I've been feeling something for a while now." Breaths. Something I haven't been able to ignore.
Sarah's heart raced. She hadn't expected this.
She had been afraid to bring up her feelings, worried about what it might mean for their friendship. But Caleb's words made her feel like she wasn't alone in this. Maybe he had been feeling the same way.
What do you mean? Sarah asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb turned to face her, his expression serious but kind. I care about you, Sarah. More than I've ever cared about anyone. And I know it's not something we've talked about, but I think it's time we did. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Sarah's mind raced as she processed his words. She had been afraid to admit her feelings, afraid that they would change everything. But now, hearing Caleb's confession, she realized that maybe she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Maybe the bond they had built was stronger than either of them had realized. I care about you too, Sarah said, her voice steady now. More than I ever expected. There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that held everything. The shared understanding, the unspoken connection. It felt like a weight had been lifted from Sarah's shoulders. She didn't need to hide her feelings anymore. She didn't need to be afraid of what came next. Then let's see where this goes, Caleb said finally, his voice low but sure. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I want you in it. The fear that had held her back for so long was gone, replaced by the warmth of Caleb's words. They were on the same page now, and that was all that mattered. For the rest of the evening they sat together in silence, watching the stars slowly fill the sky. Sarah felt at peace for the first time in a long time. She had come here to escape, to find a place where she could be herself. And now she had found that place, not just in the land, but in the person sitting beside her. Caleb had become someone she trusted, someone who saw her for who she truly was. And in return, she had learned to trust herself. As the night grew darker and the farm grew quieter, Sarah knew that her journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, still parts of herself she hadn't fully explored, but for the first time she was excited for what the future held. But she wasn't alone anymore. She had found a place where she belonged, on the farm, with Caleb, and with herself. Breaths. And as the wind whispered through the trees, Sarah knew that she was finally exactly where she was meant to be.